jogging. It felt like a punishment for some heinous crime, not an enjoyable way to lose weight and get fitter. By the time Mark had made it to the beach, just half a mile from his bungalow, he was sweating freely. His feet hurt, his lungs burned, and he felt the beginnings of a stitch in his side. Gulls wheeled overhead, on the watch for prey. Their screeches seemed to mock Mark's pretensions to athleticism. Overdoing it, he thought. First run of the year, after a winter of rich food, too much booze. Need to pace myself. He stopped just short of the steps that led from the promenade down to the beach. Taking deep lungfuls of air, he tasted the tang of the seaside. He'd timed his run to coincide with low tide so he could pound along smooth, damp sand. He'd forgotten that the stink from various rock pools would also be present. That seaside smell, he thought. Victorians called it ozone. Didn't someone say it was just rotting seaweed, really? The thought of rotting organic matter conjured up unpleasant images of drowned mariners, decayed bodies washed up on the tide. The storms of the winter had been frequent and intense. Harbour defences damaged, boats wrecked, some reckless people swept away. Vast amounts of debris of all kinds had littered the beach for weeks. Mark shook his head, took some more deep breaths, then started to jog again. The tide had done its work and left most of the sand pristine, no major obstacles. He was determined to manage a basic 2 miles this morning, and that meant pounding up the beach to the cliffs, just below the old lighthouse, then back. Easy peasy, I can do it. After another 100 yards, he wasn't so sure, though. Again he found himself gasping and sweating. Mark slowed to just over a walk, casting a glance around to see if any other early risers could see just how fat, red, and stupid he must look. There was nobody about. It wasn't long after dawn on an April morning that threatened rain. Perhaps all the other would-be joggers had looked out the window, turned over in bed, and decided to get an extra hour's kip. Sensible chaps, he thought. But then he saw evidence that he was not alone. A brownish shape appeared far ahead, midway between Lighthouse Point and Mark. It soon resolved into a dog, trotting along, just above the tide line. Where there's a dog, he reasoned, there's a dog walker. Mark scanned the beach for signs of the animal's owner. The dog, meanwhile, continued to head towards him, but then, when it was about 20 feet away, it stopped. Mark continued to jog gently forward, then slowed to a walk. He liked animals, appreciated their individual characters, their capacity for trust and affection. "Here, boy," he said coaxingly, stopping so as not to spook the dog. "Here, boy." The animal stood looking at Mark, its head cocked to one side. He made encouraging noises, then hunkered down, reducing his size. He knew that was a good way to make animals less nervous. But this one was not inclined to trust him, and still no owner appeared on the beach beyond the dog. Maybe it's a stray, he thought. As he studied the dog more closely, the notion that it might not have an owner nearby grew more plausible. It didn't look quite right somehow. He couldn't tell what breed it was, so presumed it was a mongrel. Average-sized, black and tan coat, an overlong, ragged-looking tail and rather stumpy legs. Its head, too, seemed oddly proportioned. It was lopsided, in fact, with one eye shoved an inch or two down and to one side by a bulge on the animal's skull. Oh, God, the poor thing. The dog was deformed, perhaps as the result of abuse or disease. Mark felt a surge of pity followed by anger. He was always outraged by the cruelty his fellow men could inflict on helpless beasts. Mistreatment of dogs in particular offended him. He spent too much time travelling for work to keep a dog of his own, and this only added to his righteous indignation when others abused canine companions. "What's happened, boy?" he said. "No wonder you're nervous." The dog seemed to hesitate, then took a step towards Mark, then another. He reached out a coaxing hand, inviting the dog to lick his fingers, establish contact. But then the animal seemed to take fright again, its wonky eyes rolling in panic as it leapt skittishly away. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." But the dog was already heading back the way it had come. Mark noticed then that it had no collar, but there was some sort of leash trailing from its neck, just long enough to leave a narrow groove in the sand. A greenish-brown cord? No, more likely a piece of string that had become damp and stained with seaweed. Mark envisioned a homeless person, perhaps a violent alcoholic, dragging the hapless beast around as a prop for use in begging. Not fair, he chided himself. Plenty of prosperous homeowners are complete bastards when it comes to pets. Mark stood, unsure what course of action to take. The dog, which had glanced back several times, stopped and turned to face him. Then it began to move in a wide arc, heading up the beach, keeping about 30 feet away. Torn between two impulses, he thought, a desire for human contact, friendship, and fear that I'll prove to be as brutal as its owner. The dog reversed direction, heading back to the tide line. As it did so, it gave an odd bark that sounded somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. The animal's expression, now Mark thought about it, was quite funny. Its deformity, however tragic, gave it the look of a comedian expressing mock surprise. Smiling, Mark found himself thinking of an old nursery rhyme. The little dog laughed to see such fun, and the dish ran away with the spoon. "Well, you do what you like, mate," he said. "I've got to get on. Need to get home, take a shower, eat breakfast." Mark resumed his run towards the point, again jogging at a very gentle pace. The dog continued to zigzag ahead of him, keeping a stone's throw away, looking back as if to make sure Mark was following. After a couple of minutes, Mark could make out the jumble of rocks at the base of the cliffs and the gaping mouths of the sea caves beyond. The caves, he recalled, were only accessible for about half an hour or so at low tide. Suddenly the thought of getting any closer to those dark apertures made him uneasy. The nursery rhyme had churned up a host of other childhood memories, including fears of half-open cupboards, the dread of monsters that his younger self felt sure must lurk under the bed. The stitch had begun to assert itself again, and he began to slow down, thinking to cut his run short, and to hell with his fitness program. "Sorry, doggy, I'll have to bid you farewell," he said. "Hope it works out for you." Mark stopped, bent to clutch his knees and catch his breath. When he looked up again, he was startled to see that the dog had approached much closer than before. It was maybe 10 feet away now, and giving that odd, half-laughing bark. At the same time, it kept moving back and forth, as if urging Mark to follow it. He assumed that it wanted to play. That was reassuring, suggesting the beast wasn't hurt, but Mark simply didn't have the time. "I can't play with you, doggy," he said, hoping his tone of voice would convey his meaning. "Gotta go home. Maybe tomorrow?" The dog continued its back-and-forth movement with greater urgency now. Something about the animal's behaviour triggered another memory. "What is it, lassie?" he asked humorously. "Is young Johnny trapped down the old mine shaft?" The dog tilted its head to one side as if trying to make sense of Mark's words. He felt oddly ashamed at having mocked the animal. Again he noticed the trailing cord, and this time he was close enough to see that the end was frayed, as if torn. "Someone's had an accident," he thought. Someone, possibly a venturesome child, had gone exploring the sea caves with their dog and got into trouble. They could be lying with a broken leg, broken back, right now, while he was making stupid jokes. "Oh, bollocks," he exclaimed, feeling for his phone, then remembering he'd left it on the kitchen table. "Okay, show me where they are," he said to the dog, and started to run again, heading up the beach towards Lighthouse Point. The animal kept ahead of him, glancing back at intervals to check on Mark's progress, its tongue lolling. Despite the sense of urgency, Mark had to smile again at the creature's comical appearance. Sure enough, the dog led him over slippery rocks towards the mouth of the nearest and largest cave. He slowed to a careful walk, then clambered onto the rocks. The dog seemed to have fewer problems with the weed-slick surfaces than Mark would have expected, easily bounding ahead and then stopping to let him catch up. A couple of times the man nearly fell, once catching himself with one hand and wrenching his wrist. "Better not be leading me on a wild goose chase," he warned. The dog gave its laughing, gasping bark again, turned and entered the cave. The rocks grew larger, more treacherous as Mark followed, and he realized that inside it would be almost pitch dark. He hesitated and heard the dog's odd bark echoing against the stone walls, urging him on. "All very well for you," he muttered. "4 legs good, 2 legs not so good." The cave mouth was much higher than Mark had thought, reaching up about 10 feet above his head. He could see virtually nothing inside except an expanse of damp grey walls and roof. "What if the kid is in way deep? Maybe I should go and get professional help, call the Coast Guard or the lifeboat service. Just the police, they'll know what to do." The dog's gasping bark was almost continuous now, as if the beast could sense his hesitation and was growing desperate. Mark looked round again, hoping against hope that another early riser would be nearby. Instead, he saw something peculiar that he'd missed during his pursuit of the dog. There were faint footprints in the sand leading towards where Mark had stood. They went one way. There was no sign that the person making them had returned along the beach. Here was proof positive that someone must have gone into the cave. Mark gingerly took a few steps back over the rocks to get a closer look at the prints. They were clearly visible from a few feet above the beach, but so faint it wasn't surprising he'd missed them when running along the same route. They are, he thought, prints of running shoes, quite small, a child's or a woman's. The dog's barking was louder, and he glanced over his shoulder to see that the nondescript animal had appeared at the cave mouth. "Okay, I get it," he said soothingly. "Somebody brought you out for your morning walk, and they made a big mistake." Mark turned to pick his way over the rocks. Again the dog vanished into the dark interior of the cave. Mark took a deep breath and started forward, crouching despite the abundant headroom. Something about the situation seemed to require that he make himself small, try to go unnoticed. He wondered why the screeching of gulls seemed so much quieter now. They were all far off, none circling in the updraft from the cliffs, as if they had good reason to steer clear. Wild creatures would sense danger long before modern urban man. "Oh, that's stupid," he told himself, straightening up. "Get a grip, you wimp. You're not a little boy." Despite this, the old childhood memories continued to churn and roil. The wardrobe door that was never quite shut, the terror he felt at putting that first foot down on the floor when he needed to pee in the small hours. For Christ's sake, focus. Stay in the here and now. But in the present, too, there was unease. Something about the footprints niggled at the back of Mark's mind. His own clearer prints had run alongside and sometimes over them. That was natural enough. But there was something else. What was it? He was so preoccupied with the stranger's footprints that he almost lost his own footing. Again he just caught himself slamming his already injured hand against the cave wall. Cursing, he pulled his hand away and examined it. The flesh was not just abraded, but slick with some foul-smelling gunk. He tried not to imagine what might have been carried in on the last tide. "Where are you, boy?" he hissed. The gasping bark sounded again somewhere ahead, but the echo made it difficult to be sure how far away the animal was. What's more, now that his eyes were adjusting to the cave's interior, Mark could see that the cavern divided about 30 feet in. The main cave continued to the left, turning away slightly. To the right was a small cave or tunnel, only about 5 feet high. But nobody in his right mind would go there, surely. "Where did you go, boy?" The bark certainly seemed to come from the smaller side cave. Oh, shit. Mark picked his way gingerly to the entrance of the smaller aperture. It seemed to slope away down into utter darkness. "Anyone in there?" he shouted. There was neither a reply nor an echo. It was as if something was damping down the vibration. Seaweed, he thought. Great piles of it, probably. Brought in by the tide. Whoever got in trouble probably slipped on it. Got a bash on their head for their carelessness. Mark crouched and shuffled into the side cave entrance. He could see nothing ahead but darkness. Then he heard a noise. It wasn't the dog. Something much bigger. At first he thought a person might be struggling to emerge. Yet there was something weirdly glutinous about the noise. The fetid air in the small space blew past Mark, ruffling his hair. Whatever was moving was far bigger than a man. He recoiled, forgetting his cramped surroundings, and banged his head on the cavern roof. Swearing, he fell over onto his ass, then shuffled out into the main cave, heaving a sigh of relief as he emerged into the feeble light. At the same time, as if jolted free by the shock, he realized what had been wrong with the strange footprints on the sand. They had prefigured his own almost exactly. Whoever had made them must have approached Lighthouse Point, hesitated, made as if to go back, then reluctantly started to clamber over weed-slick rocks towards the sea caves. Just a coincidence. Mark could not convince himself of that, and again he heard the slopping, heaving sound from the side cave, louder now and more urgent. Closer. He stood and started to back off, not daring to tear his gaze from the black tunnel mouth, feeling behind him for the main cave wall. The dog emerged, head on one side, tail wagging. But even in the poor light, Mark could see that it was no longer merely deformed, but almost melted-looking. It gave a fake bark that now was almost a belch, a canine impression so bad it was insulting his intelligence. What had been a good approximation of a dog's coat was flowing like hot wax, changing to greenish-brown and glistening tissue. Stumpy legs became tentacles, as did the tail and the floppy ears. The only thing that stayed almost the same was the trailing cord that had suggested a leash. It was longer, though, and trailed back into the side cave. In the darkness of that rock tunnel something was moving, a pale shape emerging slowly, painfully, into the hesitant light. What is it? What are they? Mark's brain whirled and misfired as he tried to make some sense of the trap into which he'd walked. The dog creature that had lured him in. Was it a subunit, an ally? Perhaps a symbiotic partner? Mark thought of deep-sea creatures in which the male was a tiny adjunct to the far larger female. Does it matter, he thought. The big one might be slow, probably can't stand daylight. Just run. Mark turned to flee, but out of the corner of one eye he saw a long pale shape lash out from the side cave. A stinging blow struck him on his already injured head and sent him reeling forwards against the rock wall. The tentacle wrapped itself round his leg, a second grappled his arms, pinned them to his sides, a third coiled about his throat and started to throttle him. More sinuous limbs wrapped Mark in a muscular embrace, dragged him over the rough rock floor. He felt bones snap, his vision beginning to fade. Mark began to scrabble at the sand that lay between the rocks of the cave floor. Suddenly he felt a sharp pain, one so intense that it cut through his fear. A familiar shape, curved and smooth, then jagged, dangerous. A broken bottle. He grasped frantically at the improvised weapon, but his arms were pinned. A phrase drifted through his consciousness, coming from God knows where. Playing possum. He let himself go limp. At first it had no effect. The tentacles continued to wrap him painfully tight, dragging him across the weed-slimed granite. But then he felt a slight relaxation. He gulped air desperately, gave a great heave and freed his arm. At the same time he twisted his head round to see what had got him. It was a writhing rosette of tentacles surrounding a circular maw lined with inward-pointing teeth. He cried out in despair. The thing was too big to injure with the neck of a beer bottle, and he was going to be inside that serrated mouth in a matter of seconds. A familiar, gasping laugh came from just behind him. He recalled the living bond between the monster and its decoy, twisted round and slashed with the shard of brown glass. It was a lucky hit. The smaller creature, now reverted to its hideous, true form, jerked and leapt away. A jet of inky fluid shot out from the wounded predator, spraying Mark in the face. Stinging pain forced his eyes closed, but the attack had the desired effect. The tentacles holding him lost their grip as the pain of the lesser beast confused the greater. Mark staggered upright and blundered into the cave wall. He felt blood pouring from his injured hand, trying to wipe the foul fluid from his face with the other. He could just about make out the light of the cave mouth. Behind him he heard a glutinous heaving, felt a tentacle lash his left calf. Don't fall down, don't fall down, don't fall down. The mantra of survival ran through his head as he tripped, recovered, found himself among the rocks at the cave entrance. Adrenaline could only do so much, and now the pain of the corrosive ink combined with that from Mark's cut hand and broken ribs. Blood loss could kill me, make me faint. Then that thing, reaching out. The familiar fake bark sounded close behind. He did not need to look to know the decoy was after him. The Mark who'd gone jogging at dawn could probably have kicked the thing to pieces, but he was wounded prey now. He felt his ankle gripped by sharp teeth, glanced down to see that the creature had almost resumed its dog form. He tried to kick it loose, gasped in pain as the sharp teeth tore his Achilles tendon. He reached down and jabbed the creature in the face with the shard of glass. The lesser monster let go of him. Black blood, not defensive ink, squirted from its lopsided face. "What are you doing to that dog?" Mark was so shocked to hear another human voice that for a moment he just stared blankly at the blurred form. A woman, to judge from her loud and disapproving voice, was just visible on the beach. "I will report this to the police." Mark realized how bizarre he must look, and how guilty. A blood-soaked maniac, with a broken bottle fighting a mongrel. "Help me," he shouted, agony shooting through his damaged ribs. "It's not what you think." "You monster!" shouted the woman. "Don't think you'll get away with this." Mark saw her raise her hand and heard a distant click and whir. Oh, Jesus! She was taking a picture on her phone. He began to clamber towards the onlooker, over the rocks. She started moving away, gathering speed, perhaps running. His eyes were still streaming from the corrosive fluid. "Keep your distance, you degenerate," she called. "I'll have the law on you. See if I don't." "Yeah, piss off, you old bitch," he yelled, hoping she would be outraged and call the police there and then. "You old cow," he added, for good measure. Again the dog creature fastened its vicious little teeth into Mark's flesh. This time it easily dodged his flailing attack, then jumped at his hand and fastened jaws on his wrist. He screamed in pain, dropped the bottle shard, sank to his knees, pummeled the creature with his free hand. Having disarmed him, it retreated again, giving its gasping laugh. Nothing like a bark, really, he thought. Should have spotted that. I'm too easily fooled. Mark tried to raise himself, but seemed to be frozen on all fours. He was maybe 15 feet from the cave mouth. He felt himself growing cold, remembering that severe blood loss produced that sensation. Well, at least if I die out here, that big bastard won't get me. The thought was oddly reassuring. Then he felt small teeth piercing his wounded ankle again. The tugging that followed was shocking in its intensity. The small creature was vastly stronger than any real dog of its size. But it did have one thing in common with regular canines. It was a retriever. "I tell you it happened right here," insisted Marjorie Allington, gesturing at the rocks under Lighthouse Point. "That awful man was attacking a poor little doggy, with a broken bottle, it looked like." The young police officer looked sceptical. "Well, there's no sign of either man or dog now," he pointed out. "Obviously, if you wish, you can come to the station, we can fill out the relevant forms." "Oh, really?" said Mrs. Allington. "Is that all you people think about? A helpless animal was being assaulted, quite possibly killed. You could at least search for some evidence. I provided you with facts." She held up her phone, showing a poor quality picture. "That might be a man tormenting a dog," conceded the officer. "Or he might simply have been playing with it, and you misinterpreted the situation." The policeman looked doubtfully at the rocks, while the woman spluttered with rage. "I don't see how slipping on the weed and breaking my pelvic girdle would help the cause of animal welfare, madam," he said firmly. "Now, if you don't want to make a formal report—" "Shush!" hissed the woman suddenly, laying a meaty hand on the officer's arm. He was about to protest when she pointed towards the sea caves. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "I'm sure it was someone calling for help." The officer frowned. He had heard something, perhaps a human voice, but the roar of the incoming tide made it impossible to be sure. "Could be a seagull," he opined. "They can sound remarkably—" The officer stopped in mid-sentence as a figure appeared in the mouth of the cave, crawling on hands and knees. It was diminutive, hard to make out at this distance, but it seemed to be a child, wearing some drab green and brown garments. The figure raised a hand to wave, slowly, in apparent pain. "Help!" This time the cry was more distinct. It had a pathetic, gasping quality that stung both the onlookers to urgency. "Okay," said the policeman. "You stay here. I'll check this out." Mrs. Allington stood watching as the young man picked his way over the rocks, all the while calling out in an attempt to reassure the little boy, or girl. It was difficult to tell. The pale, almost featureless face below a mop of dun-coloured hair could have belonged to either gender. "Don't try to move. I'll be there in a minute," shouted the policeman. But his words did not have the desired effect. The small drab figure crawled back into the shadows of the cave. This in turn spurred the young officer to greater efforts, and he almost ran into the dark moor in the cliffside. Mrs. Allington waited, on tenterhooks, for the policeman to emerge with the poor little child in his arms. As seconds turned to minutes, she began to wonder if he had indeed suffered a fall on the slippery rocks. It was hard to imagine any other possibility. She considered calling the police, but had a vague feeling that that could be an offence, given that the police were already present. "Oh, this is ridiculous," she said to herself, and began to make her way over the weed-slick rocks. Behind her, the incoming tide started to wash away all the footprints that had been left in the sand that morning.